Good evening, everyone. My name is Mishka Ligot, and I'd like to welcome all of you watching from the comfort and safety of your respective homes to another installment of Wisconsin Wednesdays, featuring poets Aria Aber and Elizabeth A.I. Powell, featuring their latest books, Hard Damage, out from University of Nebraska Press, and Atomizer, out from Louisiana State University Press, respectively. Our next event will be on Wednesday, December 2, and will feature fiction writer Danielle Evans with her new collection, The Office of Historical Corrections. For those of you joining us for the first time this week, Wisconsin Wednesdays is an online reading series brought to you by the UW-Madison Program in Creative Writing and the Wisconsin Book Festival. In light of the recent and current health crisis, Wisconsin Wednesdays was designed to continue with the program and foundation's practice of hosting brilliant writers, many of them alumni of the program, currently promoting their new books. Along with rising to the challenge of social distancing measures and the inability to gather in person, we hope that Wisconsin Wednesdays, through its new virtual platform, is able to carry out the Wisconsin idea, which declares that the borders of the university are the borders of the state. And so we welcome you, whether you're joining us from Madison, Milwaukee, Marshfield, Marinette, Mineral Point, Menominee, Manitowoc, Mequon, or anywhere else in the state, the US, or even the world. And right now, we'd like to take a moment to thank and promote our hardworking, partnering independent bookstores from all over Wisconsin. A Room of One's Own in Madison, the bookstore in Appleton, the Village Booksmith in Baraboo, Honest Dog Books in Bayfield, Redberry Books in Cable, Inklink Books in East Troy, Daughters Books in Eau Claire, Woodland Pattern in Milwaukee, Foxden Books in River Falls, Arcadia Books in Spring Green, Mind Chimes Bookshop in Three Lakes, and Driftless Books and Music in Viroqua. Please continue to support your local bookstores throughout this pandemic and consider placing an order for Aria or Elizabeth's books through any of these establishments tonight. Most offer shipping and contactless curbside pickup. You can find their contact information at our webpage, tinyurl.com/whiskweds. That's tinyurl.com/whiskweds. Before we proceed with the reading, we'd like to recognize that Wisconsin Wednesdays is being broadcasted to you from Tijope, which is historical and traditional Ho-Chunk land, unceded and occupied through unjust legislations and treaties such as the Indian Removal Act of 1830. We recognize the Ho-Chunk as the original and true stewards of this land and honor their continued resistance and resilience, along with the 11 other First Nations that reside in the areas of the state. Aria is joining us from Oakland, California, which is traditional Ohlone land, and Elizabeth is joining us from traditional Abenaki land in Underhill, Vermont. Finally, in the spirit of resilience and humanity's collective capacity for resourcefulness, we'd like to thank you viewers for your patience with this new online format. Please bear with us should there be some technical issues that may arise during the reading. And we'll have time for some Q&A with the authors after they read. So please use the box at the bottom of the Crowdcast page to submit any questions you have for Aria or Elizabeth at any time during the reading. And we'll do our best to accommodate your queries later on during the event. I'd like to introduce tonight's first reader, Aria Aber. Aria was raised in Germany where she was born to Afghan refugees. She's the author of Hard Damage, which won the Prairie Schooner Prize in Poetry and the Whiting Award. Her poems have appeared in the New Yorker, Poetry Magazine, Kenyon Review, the Poetry Review, and elsewhere. Aria is the poetry editor of Boat, and she's based in Oakland, where she was the 2019 Lee Shen Visiting Writer at Mills College, and she's currently a Stegner Fellow at Stanford. A recipient of fellowships from Dickinson House and Kundiman, she was also the 2018-2019 Ron Wallace Fellow for Poetry at the UW-Madison Institute for Creative Writing. Hard Damage is a tapestry of a collection, weaving together muscular lyric and precise documentary poetry. The book traces personal, familial, and national histories that leap across countries and languages, swinging from the hinges of Rilke, the Mujahideen, and the Taliban, immigration, and assimilation. Aber's poems probe and plot ideas of the self, spirituality, citizenship, alienation, displacement, belonging, beauty, and terror. Quote, at turns scathing and tender, ironic and keening, Aber writes richly of warfare and Rilke, German and English alike, end quote, writes Solmaz. A tremendous debut we are lucky to behold, end quote. Anthony Frame for the Chicago Review of Books writes, examining the effects of Western colonialism on Afghanistan and the consequences of decisions dating back to the 1950s, Hard Damage questions and mourns the idea of citizenship. The collection focuses on stories on displacement, which Aber accomplishes by breaking boundaries, breaking forms, and even breaking language. I've had the privilege of getting to know Arya during her time in Wisconsin, and yes, she's every bit the masterful and strikingly wise writer that the reviewers and accolades make her out to be, and a deeply wise and caring soul above all that. And it's my joy tonight to welcome Aria Aber. Arya?
Thank you for the beautiful introduction, Mishka. I am so moved. Yeah, and thank you for inviting me to Wisconsin Book Festival. I'll be reading poems from my book, Heart Damage. And I think I'll just start with the very first poem in the book. It's called Reading Rilke in Berlin. Into English, I splintered the way my father clutched his valise at the airport, defeated and un-American. It took me 12 strange springs to know nothing occurs out of a sudden. How do I let it go? Little has been purloined from me, and the ghosts of childhood still sibilate, by which I mean nobody has touched me on my innermost parts. At the accent reduction class, my teacher instructed me to invert my tongue like in love, so I lay at a pavement, under your elegy, in a bridge. Such starkness the want to put inside me a perfect sentence. What would have Lou Salome done? I absolved every year around the sun, knowing that there is an animal smell hooked to a line leading past a border I am not going to cross. But what is exile exactly? What exactitude? Father says hour for hour, allo for hello. Father says is good, don't come back, eat fruit, green card. If I could explain to him the difference between exist and exit, maybe others too will hear the law in a law. When they asked my mother, where are you from? She smiled and replied, fine, how are you? Oh, I shoved my hand right through the officer's mouth and ripped out his tongue. Then under my pillow I placed it and waited for it to bloom new my blood. The next poem is set in Paris. I'm realizing that a lot of these poems are set in different cities all across the globe, just because I moved around so much, and my family, they're all refugees, so they're scattered everywhere, which is heartbreaking, but also simultaneously a very rich experience because I got to see a lot of different places growing up. And it's called Afghan Funeral in Paris. The aunts here clink Malbec glasses and parade their grief with musky, expensive scents that whisper in elevators and hallways. Each natural passing articulates the unnatural. Every aunt has a son who fell or a daughter who hid in rubble for 2 years, until that knock of officers holding a bin bag filled with a dress and bones. But what do I know? I get pedicures and eat croissants while reading Swan's Way. When I tell one aunt I'd like to go back, she screams, it is not yours to want. Have some cream cheese with that, says another. Oh, what wonder to be alive and see my father's footprints in his sister's garden. He's furiously scissoring the hyacinths, saying, all the time when the tele-researcher asks him, how often do you think your life is a mistake? During the procession, the aunt's wails vibrate, wires full of crows and heavy wind. I hate every plumed minute of it. God invented everything out of nothing, but the nothing shines through, said Paul Valéry. Paris never charmed me, but when some stranger asks if it stinks in Afghanistan, I am so shocked that I hug him, and he lets me, his ankles briefly brushing against mine. I'll read a poem, a shorter one, that I wrote in Wisconsin, where I experienced kind of like the hardest winter of my life. but was really inspiring. Dream with horse. Already November makes a fool of me. Sun secretes its tacky yellow gauze on what the snowmelt has divided. Slaughterhouse, the domesticated nag. I am at a loss in the shadow of the spruces. I freeze, the faint scent of equine. Taut as a tuning fork, I meditate on the horse's heavy meat, its nostrils glistening like a liver, laboring to breathe. The real shackle, of course, is in my flesh, but my mind's harness committing its slow violence through my eyes. Looking for a sign, I smear on snow my sputum, then hair. Not a day passes that I pass as belonging here. And I think this is going to be my last poem, which I also wrote in Wisconsin in the summer. Reading Rilke at Lake Mendota, Wisconsin. I have relinquished my shame now that I have mastered what wasn't lent to my name. 3 languages, one of them dead. It is hard to misbelove all that isn't as absurd as my forked childhood. First of the menses, Padar's stethoscope, to have hours upon hours to marvel at words like driftwood, trope, misbeloved. To miss my life in Kabul is to tongue pears laced with needles. I had no life in Kabul. How then can I trust my mind's long corridor, its longing for before? I have a faint depression polluting my heart, sings the lake. That there is music in everything if you tune into it devastates me. Even trauma sounds like Traum, the German word for dream. Even in the dirty atrium, Blue was waiting tenderly for Rilke. René, he signed his letters, the apostrophe full of love. Oh, in love I was always and providential. But what I want is not of love. Its meatless mojo and limen bore me. I do not want to open, neither for food nor men. For loneliness, I keep a stone to kiss. At night, the entirety of me arches not toward the black square of absence, but toward you. Thank you. I think Elizabeth is going to take over now.
Thank you so much, Arya. That was fantastic. And I'm glad that you threw in the Wisconsin poems in there. And so tonight's second reader is Elizabeth A.I. Powell. Elizabeth is the author of 3 books of poetry, The Republic of Self, Willie Loman's Reckless Daughter, Living Truthfully Under Imaginary Circumstances, and most recently, Atomizer through LSU Press. Her novel Concerning the Holy Ghost's interpretation of J. Crew catalogs was published in 2019 in the UK. Elizabeth's work has appeared or is forthcoming in a wealth of journals, including the Pushcart Prize Anthology, Alaska Quarterly Review, the Cortland Review, Colorado Review, Ecotone Electric Literature, Forklift, Ohio, Harvard Review, Indiana Review, Missouri Review, Mississippi Review, and elsewhere. She's the editor-in-chief and poetry editor of the Green Mountains Review, an associate professor and chair of writing and literature at Northern Vermont University, Johnson. She also serves on the faculty of the low-res MFA in creative writing at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, and is a 2020 distinguished visiting faculty at the Oregon State University Bend MFA program. In Atomizer, which she'll be reading from tonight, Powell examines pressing questions of the day, from equality and political unrest to the diminishing of democratic ideals, asking if it is even appropriate to write about love in a time seemingly hurtling towards authoritarianism. With honesty and humor, her poems explore fragrance and perfumery as a means of biological and religious seduction. Evoking Whitman's sentiment that we are all made of the same atoms, Atomizer looks towards an underestimated scent as a way to decipher the liminal spaces around us. Molecules of perfume create an invisible reality where narratives can unfold and interact, pathways through which Powell addresses issues of materialism, body image, and the physical and psychological contours of emotional relationships. Quote, Atomizer spits and deluges us in the perfumery of seduction, fetish, duplicity, commodity, and code, writes poet Diane Seuss on the collection. Quote, what carries the day is the speaker herself, a fierce, traumatized truth teller whose X-ray eyes see it all in a work of harrowing brilliance and sheer heartbreak. I urge you to douse yourself in Atomizer, end quote. And douse we shall, and I'm thrilled she's joining us tonight. Please welcome Elizabeth A.I. Powell.
Thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction, and thank you so much for having me at the Wisconsin Book Festival. I was an English major at the UW, class of '87, and so it feels really nice to be here. I'm going to read to you a few poems from Atomizer. The first one's called Portrait of a Woman in the Bath. There is no cure for phantom odors. All that summer, an olfactory mirage, specter scents of climbing roses, molting their delirium through my blowing curtains, the aroma of burning hair, leather horsewhip, diesel. My mother said I had phantosmia as she washclothed my thinking into whatever she wanted, smelling whatever she smelled. I floated until she said the soap bubbles smelled of rusted locks and match strikes. Thus, I never learned olfaction properly, fond of the scent of gas station as much as bakery. In school, all the perfumes of Arabia could not wash Lady Macbeth's hands of blood. At church, Joseph's brothers sold him to merchants bearing spice and myrrh. But here in this Vermont inn, a nude oil painting of a woman in the bath hangs above the towel rack like a gender crucifixion. I float restrained in the small porcelain tub, a coffin of water. The odalisque and I are no mere bathroom selfies. A stay against anxiety, trying to love our bodies. The elusive male gaze floats in from the ether on steam, watches our ritual grooming from far away, bastion of antiquity scrutiny, the great school of Athens. The aqua wallpaper skins from the wall's surface, light reflecting off water, my hot pink robe, madness leaks, the ruse and reverie of my toilette has pruned me into the woman I am now, a bather immersed, breast rising like regimes from an army of bathers, freed from the prison of forever sponging necks in Degas. The bathwater absorbs my bones' dried violet scent and architecture, nanoparticles of wet ferns. In the hydrogen oxygen I float on, the water washing me in places I only let God perfume. The next poem is an ekphrastic poem, and it's an ekphrastic poem based on Laurie Simmons' Lying Perfume Bottle, which is the cover of the book. And it's called Lying Perfume Bottle of Chanel pour Monsieur. Tell me everything, he said. That was the top note. That was what the scent would have said if I could speak nouns like window, sun, summer, Winmorn, filling the white-walled bistro. How oak mossy the world is, and how odor is identity's first ardor. His scent opens, a portal. He said I seemed worthy of its lemony, neroli blessings, its cocoa philosophy of my life didn't please me, so I created my life. The light wafts in the window, inflects the room with Vermont in June, languidly arriving on dust motes. I am an object, ponging myself into capture's mendacities. His antediluvian cardamom yanks me, a jazz song my father listened to or a shape no geometry understands. There's something familiar about the animalic scent, the refined contradiction of all that presses into my plasticine skin. Not all scents register in the conscious mind. I hope to seize his cipher chords inside me like Arcturus flickering Reader, even the sky had a composition. He sips espresso, eats blueberries. His citrusy spell flirts the morning air. He plays the bow ideal elegantly. Now you tell me everything. I want the aromatics, how the blooming foliage comes over me like a perfume bottle's glass enclosure. I see out a Friday morning, the polite ambition of lovers. This memory, an atomizer I'm sprayed out of, droplets seep into pores. Tell me everything. He said it was advertised as a gentleman's scent in 1955 to open over a whole day, how it adorned madmen and rogue dukes of thus and such. Fantasy is what we create when we have nothing left to say about a world that has left us trendy, fetished, and empty. He researched me as an olfactory curator might, my social media Lysol life, how to turn moments into hyperrealism, daughter of the cold hard cell. Tell me everything. My father, wearing this scent, tightening his tie, his capitalist noose, thinking he's 007, slapping himself in the face with it. No woman can know him. I'm going to read a poem about a cyber psychological treatment that somebody, a business in Vermont is making. It's virtual reality that deals in odors, and it's primarily for people with PTSD, especially soldiers. And I went over there one day and spoke with the CEO and got a tour and imagined that I went on it. I did go on it, but it was kind of a different experience than I had, but I was pretty amazed by the different smells that they had in these perfumes they made to help veterans. It's called The Ordinary Odor of Reality. Is as strong as bones steeped in our bodies like red rose tea. Outer space smells like rum, so says the spectral analysis. But all my trauma reeks of baby powder and chlorine. We breathe 86,400 times a day. We ingest each other through our nostrils straight into our amygdala like 1980s cocaine or salt water over our heads. I have inhaled my worldview from the sterility of brutalist architecture, schoolrooms I have sat in. I am having a smell dialogue with mold and wet earth and sand that resides in the woods and playground inside my memory. What are your odor threat cues? Coolant, match strike, summer day, all arranged in form, a story. I put on the olfactory virtual reality headset that looks like space goggles with a scentograph that changes with each virtual image in order to confront the aqua velva, polyester bedspread, peppermint schnapps, urine, semen, and tobacco, the capture and pillage of my 7th year. Now in this warrior headdress, I combat the reality of the moment that launched my career in PTSD, cyber psychological treatment, imaginal exposure therapy to locate the past, so I can crash back through on a treadmill with my space goggles and therapist and relive it to master it and take a shovel to bury it in the wet earth, but without me. And I will read one more. It's called Stalking Me Onomatopoetically. It has an epigraph. He closed my legs like a book. Angela Carter. I sought a restraining order against the sociopathic poem that kept pounding on the door of my mind at 4 a.m., rousing me with a slap on the face with its metaphysics of sick lust and panic. The order was dated March 1st, 2016, a Thursday, rainy. The socio-poem smelled of Paco Rabanne, a cologne for men, was devilishly handsome, so elegant, so English, lyrically well anthologized and attractive, seemed to have a form that suggested well-bred content, an understanding of stanzaic architecture and deep image. Yet this poem I loved had once tried to stab Dorothy Parker at a dinner party. He had claimed to have French kissed Helen Wendler and Allen Ginsberg. How could I rationalize or reconcile my love for this poem? The poem tried to kill me too, with the same red child scissors once, then another time it was tar and feather because the poem said, I love you so much. On advice, I sought the restraining order against the poem because it couldn't contain itself, pushed me down with a conceit stronger than my fragile couplets, how it leaked an afro like antifreeze, bluish over the page and into my life uninvited, thinking it knew me better than I knew myself. The poem's arguments were convincing, but it was all fanciful diversion, a lie, all through the day and all through the night. That poem telling me I looked fat in my Lord and Taylor polka dot dress. So I bit the poem's ear again and again until it bled a scary personification of ears, stalking me onomatopoetically down the sidewalk to where I had kept my secret sonnet turns inside. I just wanted to take a nap in Brooklyn, sleep inside my source material, that pail of settlement, the origin and end of everything in my family, so that the end of my suffering might bring an insight. But the poem turned my nap in Brooklyn into a series of disturbing and surreal faces that made me awaken into the possibility that I was the one who was wrong, ruined, unable to sing. Yet sometimes I loved what the poem said when it convinced me of my tyranny. I wanted to let go. I wanted its untouchable love. I waited for the poem. The socio-poem's persona looked like Mick Jagger, wore leather pants, had biceps, smelled literary and up all night like bay rum and old books. The poem had a spell over me. Its incantory propulsion got into my blood and bile with its rhythms that made my heart race. It mailed me threatening letters, collages containing articles about what happens to women my age, how they die again and again, alone and withering like a nasty old tree from a St. Vincent Millay sonnet taught in girls' boarding schools. I wrestled the poem until it swore to bless me, but it blessed me in a language that made me feel uncomfortable. It wasn't a vowelic yawp, it was a brutal, stuttering ick that made me sick, unclean, feel subway ridden, which gave the poem a great joy. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us here. And I'm going to invite everybody else to join me on the screen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was absolutely fantastic. And I'm so excited to chat about the books of both of you. I mean, I'd like to welcome Arya back to the virtual stage. It's now time for some Q&A. So if you viewers have any questions to ask either of the authors, please use the question tool at the bottom of the Crowdcast page to submit your query. I have a question for the both of you regarding your collections to kick us off. So both of your collections grapple with politics, with current events, with the news, as well as posturing the self or the individual against or amidst these currents of information and power. And I'd love to hear how you both, speak more about your work's relationship to the news. Do you see your poems as mirrors or microscopes or counter narratives of the goings on of this tumultuous world? Do you see them as commentaries, retellings, reenactments? So yeah, I'd love to hear about that.
I guess I can go first. That's such a good question. I don't know what my relationship to the news is. I think generally I'm always suspicious of what I'm reading in the news, but also as a person who's from Afghanistan and who only had a relationship to her home country through retellings of her parents, juxtaposed to what was said in the news, because it's like a country that's often in the headlines for the last 20 years. It's been kind of surreal, the experience, dealing with the news, because it had such a big impact in my life. But I don't think that Heart Damage in itself is responding to current events. I think it's responding to past events, right? Like the documentary sequence in Heart Damage is concerned with a historical event that was kind of brushed away and not really covered in the news. So I think it's an unearthing of what is not being said about that particular country and my relationship to it. But also I think that the news obviously works with language, and journalists work with language with a very stripped away, cleanly kind of diction that tries to be as objective as possible. And I think poetry works against that, because poetry approaches the subject matter with love and respect, or at least that's what I am trying to do. Yeah.
Thank you. Elizabeth, Liz?
Yeah, so I always love to be on the side of William Carlos Williams rather than Wallace Stevens, and poetry is news that stays news. And that always stayed with me. I got my start with my first job was as a journalist, a radio journalist. And I used to have to make sound bites a lot on the old reel-to-reel tapes. And it was like splicing other people's sentences to shape them into a narrative that I could tell in, the 3 minutes on the radio. And I think that that's sort of influenced the way I view the news. I can't watch the news without seeing how people are putting it in contexts that are helpful to their thesis statement. And my poems are commentaries, yes, but they're also reenactments of, since poems enact ideas, especially through image. And in this case, with me, it's sent as image. Poems are also portals into the unknown, and they help me live the questions. And so some of these poems in Atomizer are in conversation with what it means to write about love and eros in a dark time, right? The new boss is always the same as the old boss, and historians write this down for us all, right? And historians like Timothy Snyder, we need to pay attention to patterns. And poets, I hope, are people that pay very close attention to patterns as a way to see and make meaning. Poetry is a way to transmit vital information on how we live from generation to generation, but it's also a commitment to truth as a way to move away from darkness. And it's a conversation over time and space. And in that sense, it's extremely political. And so in Atomizer, I try to use the bodily sense of smell as a way to ascertain truth, to try and sort of rest in the grace of the world through the senses. And the book asks people to trust in those senses that society wants us to forget. And so instead of forgetting our humanity, these poems try and move away from an authoritarian world, and a world where men have been telling women for centuries it's all in your head kind of thing, and to assert a stay against confusion by letting us feel our gut, our senses fully.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Yeah, I love how your answers are also very different, but they inform each other. If my next question, in the spirit of bringing you both virtually to Madison, I'd love to hear about your experiences in the program, the university, the city. I'm aware that while Arya's fellowship was just a little over a year ago, Liz, it was your bachelor's that you did here. And so I'm curious, as writers, as in your journey as writers, were there ideas, practices, viewpoints, or projects that were either born, transformed, refined, or even disposed of during your time in Wisconsin, either as recent or as early as that has been? Arya?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, my experience in Wisconsin was very recent. I really enjoyed my time there. I feel like I built a community that's going to stay and survive, hopefully for the rest of my life. And I met like-minded people, and it was the perfect addition after my MFA, I got very lucky to do that immediately after. And of course, it informed my book. There is so much Wisconsin in there. There are a lot of poems about snow and that interrogate kind of like this landscape, because I noticed that Madison in itself, geographically, the topography is very similar to my hometown in Germany where I grew up. It's small, it's very white, it's middle class and kind of like Catholic or Christian. And it's a college town, and it felt kind of like suffocating in the same way that growing up in Germany felt suffocating to me. So there was a lot of parallelism that I could draw from and kind of return to this quiet interior landscape of the self as well, right? So it definitely informed my poetry in that regard. But I also thought a lot about the land itself and America as a settler society and as a settler nation occupying land that isn't theirs, in Wisconsin in particular. I don't know why that didn't come up in my 2 years in New York. I guess because it's a metropolis, you don't really think about the earth beneath your feet. But in Wisconsin, that really came to life. And that's something that I explored in the later section in my book too. So there was definitely a lot of tension that I experienced that felt very creatively rich. And yeah, I am still, it was an unforgettable time.
Thank you, Arya. Liz?
Let's see. Well, it was a long time ago that I was in Madison, but I think what was really a formative part of my life was I was a history major before I switched to English, and I was heavily influenced by the work of Dr. George Mossey, who I took the history of European Jewry from, and Dr. Stanley Cutler, who I took constitutional law from. They impacted my life deeply and profoundly about the way I thought about the world, and their teaching influenced my political view, which certainly influences my poetics and informs my writing. And Dr. Mossey's humanity was a guiding light in my life. I had a plan to go to law school after UW. Instead, I worked for the congressman from Appleton, Toby Roth, and but I never got rid of Cutler's constitutional law class. It was always in my head, kind of like reading weird prose poems, and that has stayed with me. And one day when I wasn't a history major there in Madison, I read Lori Moore's Self-Help when it had come out, and I saw in the back of the book that she, taught at the UW, and so I immediately, ran to get in her class as fast as I could. And her dark wit and her slant on the world, and her sassy voice and cool, I couldn't get enough of that. And so I was grateful for studying with her there. And at Madison, I was also busy getting a black belt in beer drinking and spending a lot of time at the plaza playing pool and eating plaza burgers and being, a bit of a flirt and adult. I also recall a lot of Sam Shepard plays were being performed around Madison then, and that really influenced my work in Willie Loman's Reckless Daughter as well. And weirdly, the Violent Femmes were around town a lot then, and so their music was strangely an influence on my poetry too.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. My next question is specifically for Liz, and you've touched a little bit on this already, but I'd love to hear more about it. So Atomizer's poetic arms, they stretch everywhere, but the image and theme of scent hold the collection together without becoming gimmicky or predictable. So how did this idea come to you? Like, what was it like to thread together this collection, as sprawling as it is, on this one central axle? And were there any challenges that you came across putting the collection together on this very, specific theme or like running image?
So my mother's partner was a French immigrant. She had come to New York to escape the Nazis, and she worked for a French perfume house, and my mother was in the fashion industry. So from a young age I had a lot of perfume, and I was a latchkey kid also, and there was a perfume shop in the village that I could walk to, and there was a woman there who was very kind and showed me all about perfume, and I would just kind of hang out there and be in amazement of her. But also the poems came because I have synesthesia, and so I have a really odd relationship to sense. I feel colors and taste sense, and sometimes scent is so overwhelming to me, it takes over. I used to joke that when I was pregnant, I could smell rotting meat a mile away in a freezer. Um, but seriously, like the perfume interested me too because it's biblical. In the Song of Songs, and the Shulamite, and the favorite wife of King Solomon, and the uses of nard through history, and in the Christian Bible, and that was all interesting to me, and just the smell, the olfactory sense, also was interesting to me. I started to read the work of Luca Turin, um, who writes a lot about scent. He was a chemist, and Chandler Burr. Also, Chandler Burr is a journalist and a writer, but he's also an olfactory curator, and thinks of perfume as art. So that got me thinking a lot about scent as well.
Thank you, Liz. This next question I have is specifically for Arya. So Arya, Hard Damage is your first book. Congratulations. And I've heard so much mixed feedback from other writers. Some say when they write a first book, like it feels like a load has been lifted from their shoulders. And they have permission to do whatever they want now, or like to write whatever they want. Others say they feel as if they've already said everything that needs to be said. So how are you feeling about Hard Damage as a first book in like the larger scheme of your writing?
Thank you for that question. Let me just quickly say that I loved Elizabeth talking about scents, because I also have synesthesia, and I'm also obsessed with perfume. So that's really enjoyable. Yeah, okay, so going back to your question about Heart Damage, I don't know how I feel about it, to be honest. I think it's still too recent. It came out a year ago, but I'm still in the middle of it. Obviously it's so fresh. I did feel like I was writing this book my entire life, and I needed to get it out of the way in order to get to the next books that are inside of me. So it definitely felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. It is hard to refigure or like reconstruct a voice that is still your own, but is not repetitive of what you did and achieved in your first book. I think that's a struggle that I'm going through right now. How do I stay faithful to my own vision and what I did without just recycling what Heart Damage is, right? Like, what are my continuous obsessions, because they haven't changed. It feels as though I am writing the same poem over and over again, but I need to I need to find creative ways to change my approach in order to surprise myself, and to keep the craft exciting for me as well, right? And to learn more about the world, because poems are little like learning experiences, and they teach me so much. And the experience has been quite surreal and weird. There are moments where I feel like I already had a vision for a second poetry collection or poetry book, but then things happened this year and it completely reshifted everything that I had planned, and I'm just trying to approach it poem by poem as it comes along. Mm.
Yeah, thank you, Arya. That actually ties into my next question for both of you. And then after this, we can jump into the questions that the audience has been submitting. And I see a couple good ones. And for those of you watching at home, please continue to send in your questions. But my question for the both of you, Arya, as you mentioned, things have changed. So how has the pandemic affected your writing? The health crisis has affected, everyone in their own daily life. And so have you had like a particular writing practice or discipline that the pandemic's either interrupted or changed or even, instigated or developed? I'd love to hear about, your experiences like writing, while we all have to stay home, while we all have to, be more extra careful and yeah.
It changed everything. It changed everything in my life. There are many losses. I'm grieving a particular person who passed away, not from COVID, but still it happened this year. So it's just like everything is very interconnected, and it feels like a very extremely heavy time for everybody on earth right now, and it feels as though we're going through collectively. So early on in the pandemic, I allowed myself to have no discipline, you know, that I was allowed to do whatever I wanted to do because it was such an anxious state to be in. And it's really quite wonderful how quickly we as humans adapt to new circumstances, because I remember my life in March. I couldn't sleep because I was so anxious, and in a way it hasn't gotten better with the pandemic, right? We've just adapted to living with it. We've created new habits, and it feels like I have it more under control right now, my own situation. But I have noticed that I had a hard time connecting to poetry for some reason. It felt like I was escaping into fiction. So I was reading a lot of fiction, and the poems that I've been writing during the pandemic are longer. The lines are longer. So I'm sensing a turn towards the narrative, away from the clipped short line. I don't know what that signifies at the moment, but it feels as though I am trying to think through something, which the pandemic and this long process of all days melting into each other, and the sense that time is just like slipping away, might evoke. So yeah.
Thank you, Arya. Liz?
Yeah, that was well put, Aria. I feel similarly. During the pandemic, it just really has, writing poetry has helped me to realize even more deeply that my poetry is about carrying on a conversation with life and death, and that it's okay to not know answers and to sit in that unknowing, right? I forget who said it, but that somebody once said there's too much knowing has been called like the presumption of dictators and fanatics. And, like life is suffering, and poetry is an education that can try and help us out of human suffering and turn it into human learning. And so in like my most desperate moments of anxiety about the world, I try to remember that. And one thing that I always try to remember too is Rilke's idea that we must live the questions, from his letters to a young poet. And so whenever I felt like I couldn't write or anxious about writing or whatever, I would just say, like, what are the questions I'm living, and what are the conversations across time, not with, maybe with the future, maybe with my ancestors, maybe with people, other poets that are no longer alive that I like to read. But living in rural Vermont, I grew up in New York City, and I like having the space and time to live more deliberately. So in some ways, my writing has really also benefited from everything closing down. And I've welcomed letting go of the tyranny of busy life, and so sort of interrogating that idea. And also I believe in this idea of process theology, that our actions help shape God and that we are co-creators in the world. So I like to try and think of like my questions and my poetry as a way that I can like live my theology, even if everything is shut down and I'm stuck in a house.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Liz. I have this beautiful question from the audience for the both of you. What literary pilgrimages have you gone on, and why? Very, very specific. What literary pilgrimages have you gone on, and why?
Liz, can you go first? Because I don't know how to answer that question.
Sure. I'm trying to think what literary pilgrimages I've gone on.
Yeah, it's also a really complex phrase. Like, I wonder what constitutes a literary pilgrimage.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know what what they mean with literary pilgrimage exactly.
I mean, I went to like Keats's grave in Rome like 30 years ago and got my picture taken. But yeah, like a pilgrimage, like my great grandparents were refugees from Lithuania, and I went back there and went to the old city and found where they had lived, and just saw how there was really nothing left of their culture or anything but Even like the Yiddish theater that was there, it was, I could see it, but I couldn't experience it. So it was kind of like a pilgrimage to silence. Um, but I guess, what's that crazy hotel in New York City? I can't remember the name of it. I have a concussion. But I went to that hotel once, where like poets used to live and wild people, and got a good poem, wrote a good poem that I thought was good out of it. Sorry, I can't speak more
No problem. I think that's
about it.
about like travel and your writing. Maybe that's one way to put it. Arya?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I went to Prague because I love Kafka so much, and that felt like a literary pilgrimage. I do feel very close to Kafka and a lot of like the German, the German authors that weren't exactly from Germany, so who were more or less like a lot of Jewish German writers, right, who were exiled inside of their language, because that feels really close to home to me. But I always wanted to go to Sylvia Plath's house in London. I lived there for 5 years. I don't know why I never went there. I do have immense respect for places that writers have lived in. And I think there is like this beautiful connection that you can create when you go there, and when you think about your literary ancestors and you want to pay them tribute and kind of feel closer to the impulses that brought you to writing in the first place. So there is a lot of beauty in there. I think that I take literary pilgrimages probably more metaphorically with myself when I take specific books on journeys with me, right? I remember a time when I felt extremely depressed and felt as though my life was in shambles. I was in my early 20s. I think I was 21 or 22. And I brought my copy of Ariel everywhere I went. And just like every time I felt kind of confused, I would just like read Sylvia Plath, which seems super emo right now. But that felt like a pilgrimage of a sort that I could take with me, right? And I don't know. I mean, right now I'm taking my Linda Gregg book everywhere I go. So it feels like a different type of pilgrimage or a different type of journey. But I have someone with me to whom I can return internally wherever I am physically.
Yeah, thank you, Arya. There's this great question also from the audience for the both of you. Has synesthesia ever influenced your writing to the point that you feel many people don't actually understand you?
I can answer this question. I used to write so many images that nobody understood because they made sense to me synesthetically. But I've tried to pare it down, to be honest. So, but there is a lot of surreal stuff going on in my imagery in general, and I have to find out what makes sense logically on the page while still being inspired by synesthesia, especially with colors, because I have it extremely with colors.
Yeah, that's well said. I agree with you, Aria. It's kind of it does inform the surrealist moments in my poetry. And when I'm revising, I try to think of like if somebody who didn't have synesthesia couldn't imagine that in like a dream configuration, that's probably not working. But and what you were saying too about literary pilgrimage, Sylvia Plath. Every time I've been in London, I want to go to her house, and I never do. So I can really relate to that. And the hotel I was thinking of is the Chelsea Hotel, but it's pretty
Great.
cool to have two synesthetes on one reading.
Another question. Well, Arya seems to have disappeared, I guess. Liz, you can answer this for now. What music do you listen to these days as you write, if at all? If you do, what artists or genres? So do you listen to music when you write, and what have you been listening to lately?
I can't listen to anything when I write. Lately, when I've been running, I've been listening to Elvis Costello, Get Happy. I don't know why. It's like, I guess I also just kind of like miss my sister. I haven't seen her in a long time. And that was like an album we listened to a lot growing up together. And it has a lot, I like a lot of his rhythms and rhyme schemes that he uses in the songwriting in that album in particular. And so, yeah.
Thank you.
And also Spanish, classical Spanish guitar I've been listening to, because I can kind of do some kinds of work when there are no lyrics.
Mm-hmm. Arya, were you able to catch that question? I can repeat it.
What music do you listen to while you write?
Mm-hmm.
I don't listen to music while I write poetry because so much of it is sonic. Yeah, so much of it is kind of like influenced by sound and how I read it aloud. And if I have other music playing in the background, that really gets into my head. And also because I have synesthesia with sound, it kind of puts me in a weird state where I can maybe take notes if I want to write something in response to that piece, but I can't really focus when I have music on in the background. It's different when I'm writing prose. I usually listen to music while I write prose, often just ambiance music, yeah, elevator stuff.
Thank you. Let's see. More questions from the audience. What is your, this is so wholesome. What is your favorite thing about poetry, and do you have any tips for very young writers?
There's a great book by Kenneth Koch, Apple, Why Are You So Red? I think it's the title, something like that. And that is a great book to look at if you're working on poems with really young writers. It's even good for adults. I would really recommend that. And, one thing I have noticed is I've just recently been helping my son's friends with their college essays. And I remember like one of the kids, like I remember he had this great story that he read in third grade. And then I thought he had such a good voice. And, it got knocked out of him by the teacher. And then I was just like, and he still had that voice somehow miraculously in the piece I just read. So how he maintained that, I don't know, but like we need to help young people preserve their inner voice, because I think so many teachers try to squelch it and silence it. And so in any way that we can help them feel comfortable in their bodies too, because it's all about rhythm and rhyme and sonics. So.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Arya?
Yeah, what is my favorite thing about poetry? I think that it embraces uncertainty, and it is a place to explore the unknowable, as Liz said, and that it is also a place where we can learn about history, as all literature, right? Like it's a different view of documenting the human condition and the human experience. And yeah, I mean, there are so many things I love about poetry. It's just magical to me. And advice for young writers, I think to keep it fun and to read as much as possible. Like just read everything, read everything and keep a notebook and really let the poems that you're reading or the stories that you're reading inform the way you look at the world, right? Because writers are people who notice things and who have to pay attention to the world around them. And I think that a lot of young writers are extremely good at writing innovative and creative pieces because they're still in that mode naturally, where they notice a lot of things and where they pay attention to the world, and just don't get rid of that because it makes life better.
Thank you, Arya. We're actually nearing the hour, but I think we can squeeze in one last question. There's one specifically for Arya here. For Arya, what does home mean to you, especially with the way your family is spread across the world and the many places you've lived?
I wish I knew how to answer that. I don't know what home means to me. I guess home in a very basic way is where my parents are. So it is Germany and where I grew up. But that never felt like a proper home. And I also think that the word home, or Heimat, as they say in German, is kind of dangerous because it allows for fascism to arise, because you want to keep your home, like home is often something that fascist leaders use in order to induce a kind of nostalgia in their people to vote in a xenophobic and racist way. So I am trying to be suspicious of equating home with the borders of a nation, because I, first of all, never had that, which is sad. I would probably feel different if I had that, but as a refugee, I don't have that. And because studying history, being very patriotic and kind of like desiring to live in a place in particular hasn't fared well for many people. And other than that, I think that writing poetry and being in conversation with other poets and writers and reading books feels like a returning to home to me. When I read a book by someone like James Baldwin or Linda Gregg or whoever, and I feel a connection to their work, even though they are dead, I feel a recognition, and it feels like an embracing and a returning.
Thank you so much, Arya. That was a beautiful answer to a really perplexing question. Unfortunately, I think that's all the time we have for tonight. But on behalf of UW-Madison's Program in Creative Writing and the Wisconsin Book Festival, I'd like to thank Aria Aber and Elizabeth A.I. Powell for gracing us with their virtual presence and sharing their masterful work and writerly insight with us. And I'd like to thank all of you for making the long drive to your computer or your tablet to be here tonight. Please drive home safe. And so winter is on its way, and Hard Damage and Atomizer will make excellent companions for the coming months for us up here in Wisconsin before we're entombed in ice and snow. If you'd like to purchase Arya's and Elizabeth's books, please support a local independent bookseller and place orders through our partnering stores. You can find a full list of them and all their contact info on our webpage, tinyurl.com/whiskweds. And we hope you can join us at our next event featuring Danielle Evans on Wednesday, December 2nd. You can RSVP on Crowdcast and stream the event here on the date itself. You can also access a full list of our events on our webpage. Well, this is our second to last event, so or by subscribing to our email list. And so again, thank you for logging on. Thank you so much, Arya and Liz, for reading tonight. Thank you to Connor Moran for manning tech. I'm Mishka Ligot with the UW-Madison Program in Creative Writing and the Wisconsin Book Festival. All you folks at home, take care. Please stay home. Please wear a mask. Please wash your hands. Hang in there, and we'll see you all at the next Wisconsin Wednesday. Good night.